The deeper analysts looked, the stranger the timing appeared, because this story was never just about brokerage platforms, and it was never just about Canada. The real story was unfolding inside the machinery of global finance itself, the kind of machinery most people never see, the kind that operates quietly behind headlines, elections, speeches, and political theater. The machinery that determines where money goes, who finances growth, who absorbs debt, who controls liquidity, and ultimately who holds leverage when pressure begins to build. For decades, one assumption sat at the center of the global financial order. The United States could usually find buyers. Buyers for its debt, buyers for its assets, buyers for its markets, buyers for its future. That assumption became one of the foundations of modern globalization, because America was not just the world's largest economy. America was the destination for savings, the destination for capital, the destination for investment. And when investors around the world needed safety, they often ended up in the same place: the U.S. Treasury market, the dollar, Wall Street. But what happens if even a small portion of those flows begins moving elsewhere? Not disappearing, not collapsing, just moving, slowly, deliberately, systematically. That is the question now emerging inside financial circles. And it is a question Washington cannot afford to ignore. Because while politicians fight today's battles, markets are often pricing tomorrow's reality, and the numbers are starting to attract attention. China's holdings of U.S. Treasury securities have fallen significantly from historical highs. Foreign ownership trends are being watched more closely than they have been in years. Governments around the world are increasingly discussing financial diversification. Alternative settlement mechanisms are expanding. Regional payment networks are growing. And every one of these developments points toward the same uncomfortable possibility. The global system may be becoming more fragmented, not shattered. Fragmented. A subtle difference, but an important one, because fragmentation does not arrive with explosions. It arrives with choices. One agreement here, one payment network there, one currency arrangement somewhere else, one policy shift, one strategic hedge, then another, until one day the map begins to look different. And this is the moment many observers believe we may be entering now, a period where countries are not necessarily rejecting the old system. They are simply building alternatives alongside it: insurance policies, backup plans, additional routes, options, and options matter during periods of uncertainty. Let that sink in. The world's major economies are increasingly preparing for multiple scenarios at the same time. That alone should get your attention, because confidence has always been the invisible fuel powering the modern financial system. Confidence that debt can be financed. Confidence that markets remain liquid. Confidence that institutions remain stable. Confidence that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. But confidence becomes fragile when uncertainty starts multiplying, and uncertainty is multiplying. The geopolitical landscape is becoming more complicated. Trade tensions continue surfacing across continents. Supply chains are being redesigned. Energy alliances are shifting. Industrial policies are returning. Strategic competition is intensifying. And financial systems are increasingly being viewed through the lens of national security. Read that again. Financial systems are increasingly being viewed through the lens of national security. That changes everything, because once finance becomes a security issue, every decision takes on a different meaning. Every transaction, every investment, every partnership, every agreement, every flow of capital. Suddenly, economic decisions begin carrying geopolitical consequences, and geopolitical decisions begin carrying economic consequences. The two become inseparable, and this is where the story begins moving from economics into power. Real power. Because beneath every great geopolitical rivalry lies a simple question: who controls the system? Who writes the rules? Who sets the standards? Who absorbs the shocks? Who survives the pressure? For decades, the answer appeared obvious. Today, some analysts believe the answer is becoming less certain, not because America is disappearing, not because China is replacing it tomorrow, but because the world itself is becoming more complicated, more competitive, more multipolar, more unpredictable. And unpredictability changes behavior. Investors hedge, governments hedge, central banks hedge. Everyone starts preparing for outcomes that once seemed unlikely. And this is the moment everything begins accelerating. Because once enough institutions start preparing for uncertainty, their actions can create even more uncertainty. The cycle feeds itself. The pressure builds. The assumptions weaken. The questions multiply. And suddenly the conversation changes. No longer just about what happened, but about what happens next. What happens if more capital remains at home? What happens if more countries expand direct currency arrangements? What happens if alternative payment networks continue growing? What happens if strategic competition intensifies further? Nobody knows. And that uncertainty is precisely why this story matters. Because history is filled with moments that looked insignificant at first. Tiny developments, technical announcements, boring agreements, regulatory changes, almost invisible, until years later, when historians looked back and realized they were watching the beginning of something larger. The beginning of a shift. The beginning of a transition, the beginning of a new chapter. Could this be one of those moments? Maybe, maybe not. But serious observers are increasingly asking the question, and Washington is watching very carefully, because while headlines come and go, structural changes have a habit of lasting much longer. Presidents change, governments change, administrations change. But financial architecture can shape decades. Think about that for a second. A speech can dominate the news cycle for a day. A trade agreement can influence years. A financial system can influence generations. That is why the developments between Beijing and Ottawa attracted attention far beyond agriculture, tariffs, or electric vehicles, because some analysts believe they may reveal something deeper, a glimpse into how nations are preparing for a future that may look different from the past, and that future remains uncertain. Perhaps that uncertainty is overstated. Perhaps the existing system remains stronger than critics believe. Perhaps these developments will ultimately prove less significant than they appear today. Those possibilities remain entirely real, but uncertainty itself has become part of the story. And uncertainty is where markets become nervous, where investors become cautious, where governments become strategic, where history often begins turning. But many in Washington may not have fully seen this coming because the focus remained elsewhere. Campaigns, polls, tariffs, political drama, daily battles dominating headlines. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, another story was unfolding. A slower story, a quieter story, a story measured not in speeches, but in capital flows. Not in slogans, but in financial infrastructure. Not in headlines, but in systems. And systems matter because systems determine resilience. Systems determine flexibility. Systems determine who has options when pressure arrives. And pressure is arriving. Not necessarily a crisis, not necessarily a collapse, but pressure nonetheless. Economic pressure, strategic pressure, financial pressure, political pressure, the kind that forces governments to make choices, the kind that exposes vulnerabilities, the kind that reveals who prepared and who assumed the future would remain unchanged. And that may ultimately become the defining question of this entire story. Who prepared? Who adapted? Who saw the shift coming? Because the countries that recognize change early often gain advantages. The countries that ignore change often find themselves reacting instead of leading. History has demonstrated that lesson repeatedly. The challenge is recognizing which moments matter before everyone else does. And that is exactly why this story continues gaining attention. Not because disaster is guaranteed, not because collapse is inevitable, but because major systems are being tested. Old assumptions are being questioned. New pathways are emerging. And the world may be entering a period where flexibility becomes more valuable than certainty. A period where options become more valuable than predictions. A period where the architecture of global finance becomes one of the most important battlegrounds of the 21st century. And if that is true, then what happened over the past few months may eventually be remembered as more than a collection of isolated events. It may be remembered as a warning, a signal, a clue, a glimpse of forces moving beneath the surface long before they become visible to everyone else. Because history rarely announces itself in advance. It whispers first, then it grows louder. Then suddenly, everyone realizes something fundamental has changed. The question now is whether we are witnessing one of those moments, or whether this will simply become another forgotten headline. That answer has not arrived yet, but the next few months could tell us a great deal. Watch the debt markets, watch the currency markets, watch the financial agreements that receive almost no media coverage, watch the quiet decisions happening behind closed doors, because the biggest stories are often the ones nobody notices until they are impossible to ignore. And now I want to hear from you. Do you believe these developments represent the early signs of a major global financial realignment, or do you think analysts are overestimating their significance? And if current trends continue, which country do you believe will be best positioned to navigate the next decade of economic and geopolitical competition? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because this debate is only beginning.